Uh, Today we have with us two our brilliant authors and famous American intellectuals. We hope that we will hear some not only food for thought, but also some inspiration for hope in this maybe not gloomy, but quite difficult political times, 1 month after the American election. So we have today with us Professor Arlie Russell Hochschild, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and the author of many books, but at least two of them became very famous recently. The first one was already published by Krytyka Polityczna in Poland. The second will be published soon, next year. The first one was The Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. And the second one that we're going to publish next year will be The Stolen Pride, Loss, Shame, and the Rise of the Right. We also have today Professor Marci Shore, Professor of Intellectual History at Yale University, intellectual, historian, translator, and also author of books including Kawior and Ashes, A Warsaw Generation's Life and Death in Marxism, 1918-1968, and among the others, The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of the Revolution. The second one was also published by Krytyka Polityczna a few years ago. I would like to start with a question for both of you. I would like to start with a quotation taken from New York Times. This was an article written shortly after the elections of the 7th of November. This was Michelle Goldberg's comment after the election night. Quote, Trump's first election felt like a fluke, a sick accident enabled by democratic complacency. But this year, the forces of liberal pluralism and basic civic decency poured everything they could into the fight, and they lost. Not just the Electoral College, but also quite likely the popular vote. Now we know it was not quite likely, but definitely the popular vote. The American electorate, knowing exactly who Trump is, chose him. This is, it turns out, who we are. My question, and I would like to start with Professor Arlie Russell Hochschild. Do you share this view that something irrevocable, irreversible even, happened, and that November the 7th was some kind of a watershed for USA as the political nation?
Well, thank you for the question. No, I don't agree. I think that Michelle Goldberg is telling us, that this is suggesting it's an irrevocable moment. No, very few things are irrevocable. But I agree with her, it's a watershed moment. And many people in America aren't looking at that. In fact, I think we're in a moment of double denial. On the left, we have a lot of people denying who the Trump voters are for a long time. This is just stupid people. They'll go away. So that's that denial. And there's no reason for their discontent. They're irrational. So they're not rational. On the right, people are denying that they have voted in fascism. They think, oh, well, we needed a bully. People have been telling me, as I report in the new book. But no, he's just going to deal with immigration. We're going to get our economy will, quote, snap back. and they discount all of the glaring evidence that Trump is a fascist. So the first step in meeting this challenge, this moment, is to undo both of those denials.
Marci, do you share this view? 7th November as a watershed in American political life?
Yes. Well, first let me say, że bardzo mi miło Państwa zobaczyć. Ja żałuję, że nie jestem z Wami osobiście w Warszawie. And it's lovely to meet Professor Hochschild, even to meet you virtually. I wish we could all be together in person. As Michal noted, poor Michal has volunteered to do a lot of translation of my text over the years. And so as translators know, he's very intimately familiar with my voice and my thinking. I do feel that way. I feel very close to what Michelle Goldberg wrote. I would not say that it's irrevocable, because I think that people change. I mean, for me, one of the most optimistic findings about the new sociological research done in Ukraine was not that, Ukrainians have been hardwired for democracy and liberalism since time eternal, but the fact that this is a society that has tremendously grown and changed, especially in the past decade and the past few years. And that is a source of hope. The fact that people change, societies change, especially in dark moments, that's a source of hope. I don't think anything is set in time for eternity, but I do think it's a watershed moment. I do not think it's a fluke. We have had entirely too much time to think about it. I agree with what Michelle Goldberg wrote, that in 2016, I'm a neurotic catastrophist, so I was very worried. But even I didn't really think it could happen. I was panicked, but still I thought Hillary Clinton has to win. And I do think there was complacency. I think it was too inconceivable that something outrageous could happen. This time it was not inconceivable. I think this time people were mobilized, people were on it, people were paying attention. You can talk about this mistake or that mistake, but it was not complacency by any means. And America had a really long time to figure out who Trump was, which was not hard to figure out because he told you every single day. There's that great Slavic word obnaženia, which means laying bare. Like nothing was concealed. He stood up there every day, and told you what a violent, repulsive, misogynistic, sexist, racist bully he was. So it's not as if people didn't know. I am, in contrast to Professor Hochschild, I'm not an Americanist. I'm American, but I'm not an Americanist. My intellectual attention for almost all of my career has been focused on Eastern Europe. And this is the last thing I'll say on this point, maybe. When I first came, I was becoming a historian in Eastern Europe in the 1990s as the archives were just opening. It was an incredibly seductive time. You could be the first person in to see things that had been behind lock and key. And I obsessively kind of had this guilt-laden feeling that I was in the last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. And as some of you may remember, in the last chapter of that book, there's a sudden, abrupt, swift switch of focus. You're out of the dystopian part of the tale. You jump forward in time, and you're now at a conference where historians are very calmly and somewhat dispassionately sitting and discussing this totalitarian hell that is long past. And they have the luxury of being calm and dispassionate because they're looking back in time and they're trying to be objective and relativistic and understand that different times had different measures. And so, and it's very creepy. But it's also in some ways not an inaccurate portrayal, of a lot of the profession. With all the best of intentions, we try to reconstruct things and not get overly emotional. I constantly had this feeling that I'm in the last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. And now suddenly I no longer feel that I'm in the last chapter of The Handmaid's Tale. I feel that we're actually in The Handmaid's Tale. And that's a much worse feeling.
Now I'd like to ask Professor Hochschild about one of the concepts or notions that seem to be crucial for that elections and for political dynamics in US. Namely, one of your recent lectures, you said that the liberals, or the Democrats, meaning the voters and supporters of the Democratic Party, do listen to what Trump is saying, to all those his transgressions, obscenities, and then react with indignation and with shaming, and they stop here. And this moment, this is exactly at the point where his, namely Donald Trump's voters, start listening. Then he expresses his feeling of being shamed by the establishment, all those wise people want to be gatekeepers of the public debate. And then Trump fights back, pushes back with anger against shaming. And then, of course, his voters can identify, but not necessarily, not always with his claims about migrants eating pets, but clearly they can identify with his resistance against being shamed. So my question is, why is this shame so crucial as the political feeling? Why does it mobilize people in America so effectively? And why does the shaming pursued by liberals or progressives backfire so spectacularly?
Because shame is like a fuel. We're not used to taking and thinking about emotions as if they have a logic in an instance like that. But to back up, I think for the last 3 decades, the white blue-collar class, 42% of Americans, has been sinking, okay, economically, in wages, in property, and has suffered a kind of set of social consequences. More people live alone, they're in worse health, more diseases of despair, addiction, so on. And they've not just absolutely, but relative to whites who have BAs, live in blue states where opportunity is much higher, and relative to blacks, much poorer to begin with, but they too are improving their circumstance. So both absolutely and relatively, the Trump supporter has been sinking, okay? So that creates, I think, a predisposition for people to feel, I've given up on regular politics. It just neither party has spoken to our situation. Things aren't going to change. So they have turned to a charismatic leader. And Max Weber tells us there's a big difference between your bureaucratic, rational leader like Joe Biden, who says, don't look at me, look at what I've done. See, look at my policies. But the charismatic leader says, don't look at what I've done, look at me. I have magical properties, and I will magically lift you out of your distress. So that's the backstory. And the people I came to know and wrote about in my last book, there's a double whammy. They both are very proud people and are individualistic. Their culture of pride is such that, look, if I succeed, I get the credit. I can feel proud. But if I fail, that's on me. That's my shame. So I call it the pride paradox. The people who have economically gotten hit are the people most self-blaming. Meanwhile, in blue states, you have people have better opportunities, but they have a more circumstantial culture of pride. They've taken a sociology course, actually. And so this is the paradox. And I think Donald Trump has treated their shame as almost like coal. It's taken as that important. And he's prospected that coal. He's lifted it out. He's processed it. And he's redirected shame to blame. as Michael was saying in this, I describe in the book a kind of 4-moment anti-shaming ritual. Moment one, Donald Trump says something transgressive. Haitian immigrants are eating your pet cats and dogs. Moment two, the punditry shames him. Oh, you can't say that. That's not true. Don't repeat an untruth. Moment three, Donald Trump becomes the victim of the shamers. Oh, it's so hard to take these criticisms. Don't you, my followers, know how that feels to be criticized, to be put down like that? I'm taking the shame for you. It's on me now. I'm suffering. And moment four is the Donald Trump roar back. I'm getting revenge on the shamers. So in this ritual, which we see almost weekly or one episode after another, that has this emotional logic, which I don't think liberals have been tuned into, don't hear it. It seems like Donald Trump is just ranting. So my book is kind of an invitation for us to become bilingual, to listen to rationality, but also to tune in to the logic of emotion.
Now I'd like to ask, of course, Marci, if you'd like to comment directly on that, that would be also great. But I have a specific question to you, as an intellectual historian. You belong to those intellectuals who, when analyzing Trump and American politics, do not refrain from using the term fascism. The other one example is also our author, Jason Stanley, who actually wrote part of his famous book on fascism in Marci Shore's private kitchen. But nevertheless, you and Jason, you show many analogies between the historical cases of fascism and Trumpism. And obviously none of that analogies or parallels are perfect, but nothing in history repeats itself exactly. But nevertheless, the most important historical fascist autocracies in history, they were overthrown, they were beaten either on the battleground, like it was with Germany, Nazi Germany, with Croatia, with fascist Italy, or in the case of like Spain or Portugal, there was some sort of long process of resistance and reform and then democracy building. Sometimes it was peaceful revolution, as in Portugal, but it was all in a strong, liberal, international environment. So all those different historical examples when fascism was overthrown, was beaten, seem to be quite distant from the situation that US with Donald Trump as the president is now. So I would like to ask you, Marci, as a historian, where do you see some positive inspirations exactly from the history of fascist and anti-fascist politics that would help, that could inspire, that should inspire the contemporary Democrats, also the Democrats without the large D in US?
Let me, perhaps maybe first I'll respond to Professor Hochschild's comments, because I really like the coal metaphor. I mean, metaphors are a lot like these categories, like fascism. I mean, they're things that allow us to mediate between the particular and the universal. And so I'm always attracted to seeing, like, when you put those glasses on, what will you understand? I think it meshes to some extent with something I had obsessively been thinking about, because clearly, I mean, since 2016, we can't understand in liberal rationalist terms this phenomenon. I mean, in some sense, I see Obama looking back as having the tragic flaw of being an Enlightenment figure. Obama really believed in reason. He deeply believed in reason, and that's why he was so attractive to so many of us. I mean, he was a man of the university. He wrote books. He believed in evidence. He talked to scientists. He thought about like, okay, we have different feelings about abortion, but surely everyone can agree that it's in everyone's interest to reduce the number of unwanted pregnancies that lead to abortion. So we can get together and we can think about ways to improve access to contraception, and we can improve sex education. No, but he was not prepared for irrationality. He thought using reason, he could help people understand the enlightened self-interest of cooperation. I think that was absolutely sincere. I mean, this was a lot of what Enlightenment philosophy was about. And it turns out that Enlightenment reason is just thin. It's kind of existentially thin, for all the reasons that Freud exposed, because reason, or that Dostoevsky exposed. What if I don't want to be reasonable? It's like Notes from the Underground, right? Like, what if that's not satisfying to me?
That's right. Yeah.
And when I saw, people saying in 2016 before the elections that, well, Trump is appealing because he's so real, he's so honest. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because honesty here is clearly not some kind of correlation between what comes out of his mouth and empirical reality, because there's no such correlation. But I felt like what they were seeing was what Freud tells us in Civilization and its discontents. It was the liberation of repression. Now you can say anything. Now there is no more shame. Now you see a woman walking down the street, you want to rape her, go ahead, say that. It's okay. And Freud says, yes, that's real liberation. And for that, we're going to pay the small price of the destruction of civilization, which is the small price that we're paying right now. I think liberals have never quite, and this is what Karl Schorsky talks about in Fin de siècle Vienna. It's, they're the liberals, and then he's like, they didn't understand what Freud was trying to say. They thought you could keep using reason, but reason doesn't exhaust the humanity's existential condition, and so they come up against a wall. And in that sense, I think there's a trope that, that one of many tropes that we've seen before. On the question of fascism, yes, I don't feel like I'm comfortable using it. I was comfortable using it from 2016. Nothing is ever exactly the same as anything else. We use these things, be they concentration camps, imperialism, colonialism, genocide, fascism, to help us mediate between the singular and the universal. They're like Kantian concepts. They're like putting on glasses, and they help us to process the radically disparate data of reality. So no two cases will ever exactly be the same. But they are heuristically and hermeneutically useful devices. Now, of course, you can't do a control study on real life. There's no way to kind of go back and run a scene again and isolate for which variables are causal and say, well, if you were in this situation, X and Y. And in that sense, we don't know. I mean, I have this neurotic catastrophist feeling. One of the most beautiful and sad things I read recently was Joel Grey's. I don't know how many of the young Poles in the audience know Joel Grey, but he was the very famous actor who played the MC in Cabaret, which was both a very famous film, not Germany in the 1930s, and a play that ran for a very long time on Broadway. And Joel Grey is now in his 90s, and he says, we have indeed seen this show before, and I fear we do know how it ends. In terms of what possibly be hopeful, we can't go back and I keep thinking like, okay, it's a 1945 kind of moment. We need a total reset. We need a Stunde Null. We need Putin's regime to collapse. We need a whole worldwide reset. Obviously, we're not going to get those conditions. You can never completely reproduce conditions. Of the things I've seen recently, I still cling to moments in the history of Solidarność. I cling to the memory of the Maidan, because not just because it actually did overthrow, a violent gangster, but because it was a moment of revelation or illumination of the fact that we human beings have the capacity to be better even if we rarely see that, the fact that we can have that kind of generosity and solidarity, and commitment, to value, even for a flicker of a second, gives us hope. And I found incredibly inspiring, and I think they have not gotten enough attention, the feminist in Belarus. The feminist movement that really inspired that revolution in Belarus. I felt like that was the kind of feminism we need, that is not just about replacing men with women, and it's not even primarily about that, but it's really about taking a kind of vertical model that is based on kto kavo, and kind of who is on top and who is the bottom, and strength as abuse and bullying, and inverting it to some kind of horizontal model of caring for one another, which sounds a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but taking these kind of maternal, nurturing, sisterhood motifs that when I was in graduate school, we were often told we should be purging from ourselves in the interest of being, ambitious and being taken seriously as intellectuals, and saying like, no, those are precisely the kind of qualities that should become normative in the public sphere for men and women alike.
Well, I just love what Marci said.
You probably, Professor Hochschild, you probably partially answered the question I would like to ask now, when speaking about the role of the emotions that liberals do not comprehend so well, political liberals, and that Joe Biden probably personally did not, was unable to represent by himself. Nevertheless, if we read your books on the people in Louisiana, in the South, or the second one about the people in Kentucky, so it's the Appalachian region with many former coal miners who have no job anymore. There is a question which appears that, well, like a few years ago, a few decades ago, there was a very common notion on the left that this is due to the fact that the Democratic Party actually left the working people alone, that it embraced the neoliberal economic agenda. So those people actually had no party to represent their economic interests, like in this old school type of like representation, like New Deal, Democratic Party or Labour Party in Britain representing workers. But and I think it really like worked intellectually till like IRA and Bidenomics, because if you look at the economic agenda of Joe Biden, if you look at what Inflation Reduction Act was about, then it seems that really the economic interests of those working people became to be represented again by the Democratic Party. So this was the agenda for the working people. And nevertheless, Joe Biden and the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris, they lost the elections, despite of the fact that those huge economic programs were introduced. So does it actually make sense to say that those poorer of Trump voters, they just prefer recognition over redistribution, meaning like, yeah, emotions and dignity, and not just representation of their, economic interests?
Not just, no. But let me go back just a little bit to what Marci was saying, if I could. I don't avoid the word fascism now because actually John Kelly, I'll come back to the question, but you just posed, but John Kelly, for example, whose inner circle of Trump has said, well, he's the guy I worked for and was loyal to fits the definition of a fascist. And then 13 other close inner circle Trump people have used the word fascist. So I think it's okay for us to use that word too. And let me go back to what you were saying about the causes uh, of Germany and other countries becoming fascist. I think shame was a huge part of Germany's vulnerability to a charismatic leader who said, I'll make you proud. Again, it was the same thing. They had lost a lot. They were humiliated by the Versailles Treaty, of uh, the whole loss of World War One. They lost food. They were demeaned. And it was that I think Hitler partly played to. And I'm not alone among historians to point that out. So we need to take it seriously. Now, let me also say that that when we talk about a hunger for recognition, instead of economic, Trump meeting economic needs, it's not either or. I talked to a guy who said, Donald Trump came to Appalachia, and this is in the whitest and second poorest congressional district in the country, and he promised to bring back coal, and he promised better jobs. And no, he didn't bring back coal. And no, he didn't bring back other better jobs. He gave us tax cuts, but they were for the rich and in the second poorest congressional district. It didn't help us much. So economically, he had not delivered, but he had delivered a sense of, I get what you're going through. I know you're struggling. I know you feel bad. I'm going to help you. He did appeal to, I think, a shamed constituency and was offering pride. He offers promises of economic solace and answers, but he's offering something powerful in addition, which the Democratic Party didn't touch. Harris was talking about the middle class and joy. Nobody was feeling joy. That was just the wrong note. It's like, I don't see what you're going through. I don't see why you're afraid. And so visibility, I think, feeling seen, feeling someone's answering your feelings has huge power, which we've underestimated, as Marci was saying.
Marci mentioned Obama a few times, and you said that, well, one of his problems in terms of political mobilization was his faith in reason, faith in evidence-based policies, in like problem solutions, solving of different rationally defined problems. But I remember not long after the elections 2024, very many commentators, ranging from like liberal, progressive Ezra Klein to people from radical Jacobin journal, they were declaring something like the end of the Obama coalition. The Obama coalition, of course, meant this kind of doing politics based on alliance between various minority groups, as well as women, and gathering to support the Democratic Party candidate. And as we know, one of the reasons of Trump's victory was the fact that the working class, especially male faction of the working class from those minority groups, like shifted away towards the Republican Party. But do you share this view that you cannot organize progressive liberal politics anymore in that way, that you have like, you take different minority groups who feel discriminated and you make some sort of a chain of equivalence between all of them, and you like try to mobilize them versus some different ways of kinds of yeah, discrimination, for example. So do you think that the Democratic Party, the liberal forces, do they need some kind of a new realignment, something like we could observe like in the 60s, for example, that the Democratic Party reinvented itself anew, you could say, under Lyndon Johnson? Or do you think that this Obama coalition style of doing politics was a good idea, but we just need to improve something in electoral tactics, choose a better leader, find maybe new minority groups or define them? So how deep should be this change within the democratic politics, in your opinion?
Oh, it's a great question. I'm afraid I'm totally incompetent to answer it as somebody who doesn't really do that kind of political strategic thinking. I know that right after November 5th, we were in this moment of post-mortem, which was really the word of the moment, which is, well, if there had been a little more here and a little less over there and a little more targeting that way and a little more focusing here, I was slightly skeptical about that. I'm not a political consultant or a political strategist. It seemed to me that Kamala Harris was like just right out of the gate campaigned with extraordinary energy. She didn't have very much time. I think she mobilized 1,000%. You can always say like, okay, well, in this meeting, maybe she should have focused like another 30 seconds here and a little bit less there. And maybe there should have been, more of a coalition here. I don't know that I feel like what happened was that there was something very dark going on, that was beyond what a kind of tinkering with democratic political strategy could do. But that's just my intuition. And Arlie may well have much better intuition about this. I mean, one of the things that just terrified me were the secret vote ads that came out at the very end of the campaign. And Michelle Obama gave this extraordinary speech, which I just want to put out there. Like that was, for me, that was the second time I was completely blown away by Michelle Obama in this context. The first was after the Access Hollywood video came out in 2016. Michelle Obama gave a speech in New Hampshire in 2016, in which she spoke implicitly and directly as a woman who knew what it was like to be that object of some kind of sexual harassment and being demeaning and fear of assault. She owned it in a way that I thought Hillary Clinton never would have gotten up there and owned it that way, precisely because she was a different generation. And I thought of like the first generation of assimilated German Jews who never would have drawn attention to the fact that they were Jews who might be victims of anti-Semitism. But Michelle Obama owned it. That was an incredibly powerful speech. I thought it was the best speech of 2016. And I naively thought, okay, that's it. It's over. He's not going to get a single vote from a single woman. How could you possibly vote for the rapist? And no, I was completely, completely wrong. He got the votes of 53% of white women. And now, 8 years later, Michelle Obama came out with a speech about, the price that women pay for restrictions in reproductive health care, which I think was one of the great feminist speeches of all time. She takes a deep dive into all sorts of embarrassing graphic details that people usually don't go into, and I've never seen anything like that on this kind of political stage, with incredible power and knowledge. And I thought there's nothing better than that. And one of the things she said, which I think unleashed then these secret vote ads, to get back to that, was she was speaking to women and saying, remember, no one knows who you vote for. Remember, you can vote against the men in your lives. They won't know. And she was also speaking to the men saying, don't let us be the collateral damage of your rage, because we're the ones who are going to be that collateral damage. And then the Lincoln Project, and I guess another organization, maybe it was the Kamala Harris campaign, I don't remember, came out with a couple versions of the secret vote ad, which was essentially targeting women who were afraid to vote against what their partners wanted and telling them in that booth, in that secret booth, nobody will ever know it's okay. And that to me, and I understood why they did it. I don't think that was necessarily the wrong thing to do, but that was a scene really out of The Underground and The Handmaid's Tale. And the violence that was the subtext there was chilling, because you understood that this was a mass campaign targeted at women who were clearly afraid of these men in their lives. And like the violence that was underneath that. I watched it with my 12-year-old daughter, and she said, Mom, the first thing that's wrong is that those women shouldn't have been married to those men in the first place. And I was so proud of her. I was like, yes, that was one of my better parenting moments. I'm glad you picked up that point. Yes, the first problem is that those women never should have been married to men they're afraid of in the first place. But that kind of darkness, that seems to be a much more essential root of the problem than tinkering with, what should be the more smooth or more sophisticated progressive agenda. But again, I'm not a political strategist, so I could be wrong.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, Marci. Having hung out with people in the hollers, I have a slightly different perspective, because they heard Michelle Obama's speech too, and they listened to it, but it didn't speak to them. And that's because, and they're too big a group to ignore, the white working class. Most people don't have a BA, and they are downwardly mobile. And what they heard her speech and said, okay, women, yeah. And the women heard the speech and said, yeah. But it doesn't speak to our dilemma. And so we used to, how do we speak to it? I think, going back to what Michael was saying, that the Democratic Party needs to make a giant realignment that gives a proper focus to social class. We don't forget feminism, we don't forget race, but we reach out. We used to have a labor movement. It used to be labor unions, but they basically began to lose power, as we know, from offshoring, and now only 9% of the private workforce is unionized. And it used to function as the middleman between the working class and the Democratic Party. And we need to get a functional equivalent of that. We're missing it. And now, as you were talking, Marci, I was thinking, how would a certain guy I interviewed respond to the movingness of The Handmaid's Tale, and your daughter saying, "Oh, they shouldn't be married to these men." Another way to look at it is from the unmarriageable man's point of view. I think men are in a free fall. They are in a crisis, and we can't ignore them. They would like to be good dads. They would like to not beat up their wives, but most of them are divorced and addicted and ashamed of it. So we've got to kind of look at their situation and incorporate them, which I think we can do to speak to the question, can we reach across? I think, yeah, definitely we can do that on certain issues. But the man I was thinking of is a guy who, when I first met him, said, "So I'm trailer trash, okay?" And that means he's born in a trailer park. He's poor. I'm a dumb hillbilly, and you're going to look down on me, basically was saying. And then he said to me, there are two narratives. I was interested in his very use of the word narrative. He's not an educated guy, but I picked it up, and he said very smartly, I think, one narrative fits a white middle class, so you work hard, you do well, you get into the middle class, you get proud, good for you. And the other narrative is you're Black. Okay, if you're Black, you're poor. And if you're poor, the reason for that is racism. So you may not be proud, but nobody's shaming you. He said, how about a guy like me that's poor, white, male? I'm supposed to be privileged, as a man and as a white person. But what if I don't make it? It's not because of racism. It's got to be because something wrong with me. I'm lazy. I'm dumb. I haven't taken advantage of opportunities. So he kind of he liked, so what's a guy like that to do? He doesn't go for Donald Trump. He is not a true believer, but he feels like the Democratic Party is just a bunch of committees based on identity politics, the women's group, the Black group, the trans and LBG group, and he doesn't see any mention of class. And so I think that's how we need to realign, and there are some ways we could begin to do that.
Professor Hochschild, Professor Shore, thank you very much for what you said. Thank you very much for visiting us online here in Warsaw. We are pretty sure there will be many opportunities, occasions to speak, maybe online, maybe not, maybe offline as well. We hope we will be able in the future to have you as a guest also physically.